Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing this important hearing on human rights in Brazil. As you know, um, as you know, Amnesty International is a worldwide movement of people who campaign for internationally recognized human rights for all. And our supporters, like yourselves, are outraged by human rights abuses, but inspired by hope for a better world. So we work to improve human rights campaigning through international solidarity. What I would like to do is that since some of this material has already been covered, I will just underscore some of the points made, and therefore as I'm going through this, I'm editing some of my remarks because some of this has been covered.
Will appear in the record.
Yes, it will appear in the record for sure, and which has been submitted. So I'll provide a little background discussion and maybe cover two or three points that perhaps was not touched upon. So just for some basic background information, as many of you know, Brazil does, or it boasts some of the most progressive legislation in the world, which were set out in the 1988 Constitution and subsequent legislative reforms. The country, as you may be familiar with, was one of the first to develop a national human rights plan and has recently launched its third plan. Similarly, since the transition to democracy, which was mentioned earlier, the space that has opened up for the scrutiny and criticism from a wide and diverse media, as well as a strong and developed civil society, has been notable. Under President Lula, extensive social investment under the Bolsa Familia plan, which provide grants to poor families in exchange for schooling their children, has been recognized as reducing socio-economic disparity. At the same time, the government has launched numerous plans and projects to address various human rights related issues. Also, Brazil continues to be an active participant in the UN system, recently undergoing the Universal Periodic Review process and being one of the first countries to extend a standing invitation to the UN special procedures, having been visited by the numerous special rapporteurs. Above all, the last two governments have been largely open to human rights problems that they face, recognizing many of the worst violations and sometimes seeking support from the international community to address these problems. However, there's the openness of the governments and the strength of the law have not been matched by the full and effective provisions and protections of human rights for the populations. These have been hindered by a number of factors. A, the large socioeconomic disparity, which has denied millions of access to human rights. B, the high level of urban criminality and gun violence. C, the extensive prevalence of organized crime and corruption, especially involving law enforcement agents, which was touched upon. D, a slow and discriminatory criminal justice system. E, short-term policy making directed by vested political and economic interests. And F, the inconsistency and weakness of certain state institutions. Also, what we see is that human rights groups over the years have raised serious issues related to police violations and public security, torture and prison conditions, access to land, the rights of indigenous and Afro peoples, slave labor, as well as cases of violations against women and minorities. In such a society deeply divided and given the inevitable confrontation with the vested political and economic interests, the concept of human rights has been persistently attacked and undermined. As a consequence, it is often described as being merely, i.e., the defense of criminals. Human rights defenders continue to suffer threats, attacks, and even killings, while the space for discussing human rights is under threat. I do believe perhaps the most troubling and most recent example of this has been the furor surrounded the presentation of Brazil's third national human rights plan. Though the plan itself is broad and inconsistent in parts, it undoubtedly stands as a strong and democratic and transparent recognition by Brazil of its need to meet national and international obligations, being signed by all the ministers and the president. However, the third National Human Rights Plan promises to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to look into human rights violations of the military regime, ensure peacefully negotiated land evictions of land activists, and supports women's sexual and reproductive rights, have now been challenged by the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces, the Agricultural Lobby, and the Catholic Church, respectively. So what we find is that now the Brazilian government is backtracking. The president, relative to this national development plan, immediately denied knowledge of the details of the plan, and all three presidential candidates have effectively distanced themselves from human rights. What we see is also, I think it's important to mention that was not covered specifically here, was that this message has been further reinforced following a decision by the Federal Supreme Court on Thursday, that is April 29th of last week, to uphold the 1979 amnesty for torturers, killers, and rapists of the military regime, a decision which has sought compromise over justice and was supported by all of the presidential candidates. And so what I will do is, since many of these issues have been covered, public security I think has been covered, police killings and extrajudicial executions I think have been covered. We have some of the same numbers there, and I don't think I should just reiterate the same numbers. Maybe I'll just, for like 1 minute, talk about the organized death squads, and just really briefly about impunity. I think it's important to mention the intersection of what Ms. Martin was saying, Wilkerson and Caballero, about death squads and how death squads operate. What we find is that during 2009 and 2010, there have been recurrent reports of human rights violations by federal and state police officers involved in corrupt and criminal activity, and killings perpetuated by death squads involving active and former members of the police. In Rio de Janeiro, investigations into parapolicing uncovered a web of corruption, violence, and intimidation which extended into the heart of state institutions. At least 17 public officials have received death threats from militias and criminal gangs, including 3 judges, 7 prosecutors, 5 police chiefs, and the head of the parliamentary inquiry into militias. They are now all receiving police protection. In 2008, a parliamentary inquiry into the role of parapolicing groups was launched. The inquiry has uncovered extensive links between corrupt police officers, parapolicing groups, and state deputies accused of profiteering from the protection of mafia-style controlled local businesses and ensuring their own election in militia-dominated areas through intimidation and coercion. As a result of the inquiry, several key militia leaders have been imprisoned, though efforts to challenge their financial activities have not been implemented. One of the areas of concern, and I think also, I would like to touch briefly on, and I think it intersects nicely with what was said versus going over all of the key issues here, is that impunity for past violations. And I think this is what Ms. Martin was speaking about, and Mr. Wilkerson and Mr. Caballero. What we find is that one of the contributions of the National Human Rights Plan, that is the plans that Brazil produces over time, is a promise to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate abuses under the country's military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985. Some NGOs and relatives of victims criticized the initial proposals, as the commission's remit did not appear to include the prosecution of past violators. However, even this limited proposal has been strongly criticized by the Brazilian military, with the Minister of Defense attempting to further weaken it. Nevertheless, increasing challenges have been made to the long-standing impunity for crimes committed during the military era. In August, the Supreme Court ruled that Uruguayan national Colonel Manuel Cordero Pasitini could be extradited to Argentina to face charges in connection with enforced disappearance of Uruguayan and Argentine citizens and torture in the context of Operation Condor, a joint plan by Southern military governments in the 1970s and 80s. In addition, a submission by the Brazilian Bar Association and a leading judicial expert to the Supreme Court challenging the interpretation of the country's amnesty law was overturned in April of 2010. That's the decision from last week. The Supreme Federal Court judges ruled 7-2 to uphold the interpretation that crimes committed by members of the military regime were political acts and therefore covered by amnesty. The ruling flouted Brazil's obligation under numerous international and national human rights laws. The heritage of the failure to prosecute the crimes committed by members of the military regime lingers today. Few of those responsible for extrajudicial executions, excessive force killings, and acts of torture committed in Brazil are never investigated, let alone brought to justice. Notable massacres from the 90s, the Carandiru in 1990s, the killing of 111 unarmed detainees in Sao Paulo, the Vigiado Geral 1993 massacre of 20 unarmed favela residents in Rio de Janeiro, and also the El Dorado dos Carajas massacre in 1997, in which 19 land activists by members of the military police in the state of Pará. All of these cases are still lingering in the courts. What we find is that one of the few cases where persistent and national and international campaign has helped to ensure some justice is the murder of environmental and land activist Sister Dorothy Stang. Only a few days ago, one of the men who ordered her killing was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a rare occurrence in a land related to killings in Brazil. Conclusion. If there's one message that the U.S. Congress can send to Brazil, it is to remind Brazil that it is developing a key role in regional and world affairs, which gives it a greater responsibility to adhere to national and international human rights obligations. It is essential to time and again to remind Brazil that the concept of human rights in public space is important. Amnesty International is eager to work with members of Congress, including the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, to improve human rights conditions in Brazil. And we, along with this commission, are available to make concrete recommendations about ways to move this forward. Thank you very much.